Hey everyone, welcome back to the Headphone Show. This is Precog, and today I'm going to be taking a look at the 64 Audio TF Fourte. This unit was provided by Headphones.com, and as always, what follows are my honest thoughts and opinions to the best of my ability. Oh yeah, and I always forget to mention this, but I do have a written review to this, and it will be linked below. Go check that out if you want to see my source, my tracks, and more detailed analysis of this IM. But yeah, 64 Audio is one of my favorite brands. I'm just going to say it straight up. But while they have no less than 5 flagship-worthy IMs in their lineup, there is one of them that towers above the rest, and that is the TF Fourte. This is their 4-driver flagship behemoth that clocks in at a hefty $3,500. So yeah, not cheap at all. But devoid of price, I'm also going to explain why this is the hardest IM to love out of their lineup. Let's take a look. Okay, so I'm just going to keep it real with you guys. The Fourte is a strong contender for one of the most underwhelming unboxing experiences that I have seen. And so let's just dive into the accessories, which in my opinion do not fare much better. Here is the hockey puck case that the Fourte comes with. This is a simulation leather case, and if you're not familiar with the grades of leather, simulation leather or imitation leather is the lowest possible form of leather. It generally consists of small traces of actual leather mixed in with plastic and other materials to offset cost. It's not going to patina, it's not going to age gracefully, and it doesn't have any of the desirable characteristics that something like full-grain leather exhibits. This is definitely a usable case, and it'll definitely get you by, but I really would like to have seen 64 Audio include their hockey puck case in aluminum with the foam insert, or maybe even their Pelican case with their custom foam insert as well. There are just certain expectations that come when you're paying upwards of $3,000 for an IM, and this is one of them. Over here is the stock cable. I want to say this is the premium one, and along these lines they have two lines. They have a premium and a standard cable, but the bar is so low I don't think it really matters, I'll be honest with you. The tactility on this is almost like paper machete. It just doesn't feel very pleasant. And then for the ear guides, you can see that it makes use of memory wire, and that's not something that you want to see for a couple of reasons. One, it's just really annoying to use in practice, and two, it inherently exacerbates the strain on the IM's connector joints every time you adjust these. Maybe this is great if you're actually performing with your IMs on stage in a more professional capacity, but the thing is, the Fourte is a more audiophile-oriented IM. It's like, it says that right on the site, and most people are not going to want to deal with these issues. Personally, and this is just my take, I think that swapping out the cable on 64 Audio IMs is basically mandated. Here are the ear tips, and you get two sets. One is their foam True Fidelity ear tips, and then you have a set of silicone wide bore tips as well. Decent tips in general. I don't really have any issues with them, but I personally do not use them, so here they sit in the box. Here's the Fourte itself. 64 Audio says they are using copper patina faceplates, and I do wonder about that. I don't think the faceplates themselves are actually made out of copper, and I think it's more so a reference to the aesthetic. This is just based on tactile feedback, and it's speculation on my end, so don't hold me to it. That aside, for fit and comfort at least, the 64 Audio IMs are top notch. They all sport a very similar teardrop shaped design, and at least for me, this is one of the most comfortable IMs that I've worn. I can comfortably keep it in my ears for 5 to 6 hours at a time without too much discomfort at that. A large part of the reason for this is their proprietary Apex technology. If you're not familiar with what this is, it's essentially an air pressure release system that releases the pressure that often builds up when you have an IM in your ear for a prolonged period of time. I cannot attest enough to how useful and practical of a feature this is, and it's a large part of the reason why I am a steadfast proponent of this brand, despite the decidedly lackluster accessories and presentation. As for how the Fourte actually sounds, well, this just might be one of the most dynamic IMs that I've heard. And I think it makes most sense to give an example in this context, because everyone has their own interpretation of what qualifies good dynamics. Personally, I listen to a lot of EDM, and a track that I thought really highlighted the Fourte's dynamics was Illenium's Broken Ones. At around 30 or 40 seconds in, the cadence of the track starts picking up, and the hits become more successive. You can just feel the energy building up slowly, gradually on the Fourte. And then at 056, there is a sync to the bass line, where it sounds like the Fourte is just sucking in, about to breathe out all that energy. And here it's not about the sheer contrast, so macrodynamics, so much as it is the weight, vigor, and intensity with which the Fourte articulates dynamic swings. When I talk about dynamic swings, I'm most closely talking about those peaks and valleys that are inherently present in a given recording and the way an IM scales them. It would not be an understatement to say that the Fourte is without peer in these metrics, and there are very, very few IMs that I've heard that can remotely come close to the Fourte when it comes to its dynamic range. Something else that immediately stands out about the Fourte is its imaging performance. If you've read any of my reviews, then you probably know that, at least in my opinion, the vast majority of IMs do not have good imaging. The IMs that have the image distinction, that incision to qualify the often misused buzzword, holographic, are the few and far in between. Needless to say, the Fourte is one of them. Left-right channel separation is excellent, and the Forte's center image diffusal, at least, is mind-boggling. The Fourte probably has one of the deepest sound stages that I've heard. Of course, there are a few caveats, which I will get into shortly, but by most accounts, at least in my opinion, the Fourte sets a strong precedent for imaging. By more traditional metrics, like detail retrieval, there's a common misconception that the more balanced armatures that you can cram into an IM, the more detailed it will sound. But it's not that simple, and what matters most actually is how these balanced armatures are implemented. In this respect, the Fourte plays ball with a lot of the higher driver count IMs that I've heard. Stuff with 10, 12, 13 balanced armatures, yeah, the Fourte plays ball with them. The detail retrieval on the Fourte is nothing short of incredible. And I do want to highlight the mid-range here. There appears to be some sort of micro-texture to the way the mid-range is articulated, the transients themselves. And I really just can't get enough of it. And I don't like using words like moist or wet, but I think they're appropriate here to describe the Fourte's mid-range. It's just that alluring. Okay, so I've heaped praise after praise on the Fourte, but if you've read or watched my reviews before, then you know that never happens. There has to be a caveat. And yeah, there is. It's tonality. The Fourte is just unabashedly colored at the expense of tonal accuracy. So let's take a look at the frequency response graph, and I will do my best to break down the tonality of the Fourte, which is pretty wonky to say the least. Here's the graph of the TIA Fourte, and as usual, I do want to drop some disclaimers. One, if you don't know how to read graphs, they are a great reference point, and I would recommend checking out Resolve's video that breaks down the basics. Two, this measurement was taken off of the IEC 711 coupler. There is a resonance peak at 8K Hz, and as such, measurements after this point should not be considered entirely accurate. And three, graphs don't always tell the whole story, so at the end of the day, your ears are what you should be using to make a final judgment call. Okay, so starting with the bass, the Fourte exhibits a largely sub-bass oriented curve up until around 200 Hz. This is pretty much exactly what you want to see. On a more intangible level though, the bass on the Fourte is decent, but not what I would qualify as best in class. I do find myself preferring the bass on 64 Audio's own TIA Trio, and to this end, while decay is about equidistant between the two of them, so fairly drawn out, transient attack is a lot cleaner on the TIA Trio. The Forte's subwoofer exhibits an inflated quality to the way it slams, not dissimilar to some less capable dynamic drivers I have heard. One might suggest that this lends to the Forte's, I guess you could say, grandiose presentation, but I would be remiss to ignore the Forte's bass deficiencies in isolation. So the mid-range is where things get interesting to say the least. You can see from the graph that the Fourte dips from around 600 to 1000 Hz, and then it exhibits another dip from around 3 to 4K Hz. These sorts of dips in frequency response can often impart a sense of spaciousness, and I suspect that there is a similar behavior going on with the Fourte. You might remember my earlier comment about there being caveats about its center image distinction. I had to do a lot of listening to figure out what was throwing it off for me exactly, and even then it's pretty difficult to articulate. So on my usual test track for center image distinction, Sawano Hiroyuki's Cry, perceived soundstage depth is exceptional. But there appears to be a disconnect between the placement of the vocalist, Mizuki, and when the drums enter from the far back at 22 seconds in. Image distinction is somewhat discombobulated, if you will, skewed upwards and hollow on the vocalist, and then fuzzy in the far reaches of the stage when those drums enter. Those drums, they just don't resonate quite as sonic wall free as they do on something like the 64 Audio U12T by comparison. And then, as I alluded to earlier, there are the tonal inaccuracies that plague the Forte's mid-range. A lot of female vocalists have a pronounced nasal quality to their voice. Instruments simply do not sound correct either. And while this might seem like a cop-out, it's not a case of just certain instruments, so much as it is most all instruments not sounding tonally correct. Of course, this also isn't helped by the Forte's treble. Treble on the Fourte is about as wonky as its sound signature as a whole. So stick impact remains fairly recessed despite this 5K Hz peak in the lower treble, and that's because of the emphasis in the mid-treble from around 8 to 10K Hz. There's good amounts of crash in the mid-treble, followed by a recession from around 10 to 14k Hz. But of course, this wouldn't be a 64 audio IM without the infamous treble peaks. The Fourte peaks extremely strongly from around 15 to 17k Hz. Bear in mind that the IC 711 coupler is not accurate after 10k Hz, so as usual I verified this by ear with sine sweeps. You know, a lot of people will cite the treble as the Fourte's biggest deal breaker, but for whatever reason I don't find the Fourte's treble particularly offensive. It's just a little bit wonky. And this elevated quality certainly does wonders for the Fourte's perception of detail, as I frequently hear faint treble resonances and minutiae that I don't recall hearing on many other flagship heavy hitters. Okay, so I'm going to hold off on any in-depth comparisons as I do have an upcoming 64 audio shootout video, but just put it this way. If you're thinking about buying the Tia Fourte, I would probably hold off and take a look at the Tia Trio instead. The Tia Trio is its younger brother, but in a lot of respects, the Tia Trio is the more mature of the two. Sure, you have some minor cutbacks in technical performance, namely the Tia Fourte's incredible dynamic range and imaging, but in a lot of respects, the tonality of the Tia Trio is a lot more desirable. And to be completely honest with you, if I had to choose between the two of them, completely devoid of price, I would go for the Tia Trio every time. So clearly there are a number of reasons why the Fourte is a tough recommendation. I did find myself enjoying the Fourte quite a bit on stuff like Slanders Anywhere and a lot of Dreamcatcher stuff, where I'm looking for a more specific coloration to my sound. In these songs, the way the Fourte presented sound, so tonally wrong that it almost sounded good, is something that I don't think you're going to find elsewhere. Ultimately though, I don't think that these certain instances refute the Fourte's shortcomings. And if 64 audio could capture the Fourte's impressive technical prowess and a more tonally balanced IM, I think they would have a real winner on their hands. As it stands, the Fourte is more of a technical specialist, and a niche one at that. As always, I hope you guys found this video review informative, and I will catch you guys in the next one.